that was a successful launch, wasn't it? Welcome to Chaps Many Cultures, episode 122, and we're talking about cars, seeing as we managed to get that thing started and off the line successfully. Let's see if we can do it with the rest of the show, shall we? Yes, this is a show where we talk about the culture of business, the business of culture. And is there any more fun culture than car culture? That's my question to you, pal. How are you today?
I am marvelous. And it's episode 122, 123? I thought 122. 122. Okay. Did we put the right number on our thing?
Yeah.
No, we didn't. Okay, well, I guess we'll fix that afterwards. We're so ahead of ourselves because our car goes really fast. Could you tell? Baby, you can drive my car. Dim, 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 dim. Oh Lord, won't you buy me? Well, enough of that. Yeah, I'm marvelous. How are you doing?
I'm fantastic. I'm driven for success. That's what I am.
All right.
Enough of the references. Yes, yes, we were talking about car culture, and of course we've got the culture of cars, which I guess, you know, I wouldn't call myself a really big car guy. I mean, I like cars, I like driving nice cars, but it's a culture. People really get into their car culture, and it also brings them to a state where they kind of just do what we do in cultures, right? People like Seth Godin says, people like us do things like this. Yeah. We have our brands, we have our allegiances, we have our passions, and all that kind of thing. But of course, there's also the country culture, the origin of the car, which, as I kind of shared with my good friend Christian here, a short little series which actually pointed to some of this, and it got us thinking about car culture itself and what it represents about the countries that some of the most iconic car brands in the world come from, right?
Did you not just recently get a new car?
I did, yes.
So there we go. We can talk about that too.
Yeah, I don't know. It was a process.
Yeah.
Buying a car is a whole situation as in owning a car. The joy comes with owning. I don't know about the buying, but we'll talk about that. That's another episode.
Here's what I find interesting, because what you just described, the gearhead, the motorhead subcultures of auto aficionados is something that is seen across the board in many cultures around the world, right? So you see people being fans of a certain brand, and they are supporters or passionate about their particular car brand, regardless of passport, regardless of language, regardless of where they're from in the world. And I don't want to get too deep into that, because I think that is a phenomenon that has followed humanity for maybe 100+ years now. And I have this feeling, or this inclination, that with the way we approach mobility in general, our individual or group mobility, that is changing. I think there's the way younger generations are looking at what it takes to drive a vehicle, or to drive themselves, or get from point A to point B. The attitudes around that are changing. And I see with my children, they both are driving, and yet they have no attachment to the vehicle itself, and their generation doesn't seem to have an attachment to ownership of a vehicle the same way that my generation did, or my parents' generation. So I think there's a cultural shift evolving. But as you said, Brett, you made me aware of a documentary, or I don't know, maybe we call it that documentary,
Yeah.
that is available on Netflix by a gentleman who is looking at 3 countries through the lens of the cars built in those countries. So he tours around Italy, Germany, and France, driving only cars from these countries, and he makes some interesting observations and some deductions that maybe not very scientific. However, I think he's hit some right notes here, the right vroom vroom sometimes, when he describes the nature of the people from that country expressed through the engineering product, which is the car, right?
Mhm.
So have you ever thought about it that way when you bought a car or drove a car? Have you ever sat in the car and said, well, this is typically because the car is made from those people? Is that something that ever crossed your mind?
I think it has. It's influenced what I've driven over the years, I think. And I just want to just welcome Tarun here, who
Yes.
says, love cars and goes to car shows, and but don't love car culture. So therefore, you cannot, right, you can be or love the thing, love the item, but the car culture, yes. I mean, I'm with you, Tarun. I think that the actual car culture I'm lost with. I don't really get into that. So to answer your question, is that something that that I think about? Look, I've always loved BMWs. I've always had this kind of wish to own one, and now that after I moved to the US, I've owned 3 of them, right? And there is something about sitting in that car that represents what I think of when I think of German culture: high engineering, really, tight specifications, very low tolerance for error, and quality. That's something, just like you, right?
What?
So
Okay, here's why I'm not challenging you on that, because the B in BMW stands for Bavarian, which
right.
is where I'm
Home-
from. So I'm
home ground,
okay with
right?
it. Plus, I like their cars too, right? And
Absolutely, home ground.
of course, we're only halfway joking. There is, I
Yeah.
think, some credence to the way the product is marketed or is actually built and put together and designed, because I think German cars have a reputation around the world, and some of that is a reflection of the quote unquote quote German mindset or German psyche, and Germans like to be identified that way. Germans, I think, revel in general. I'm not saying every German, but overall, most Germans, I think, are quite happy about the way they as people are being perceived around the world based on other people's satisfaction with the cars made in that country, right? So if somebody in Australia drives a Mercedes Benz and they like it, they probably draw a conclusion, oh, well, these are Germans and probably they built this nice car, and so I guess Germans are somewhere like this, right? So Germans identify with that to a certain degree. I remember this growing up. My dad, I think he still has a subscription to the magazine in Germany, the car driver, I think it's called Auto, Motor und Sport, car, motors, and motorsports, right? And he's got a subscription. I think the magazine is what, twice a month or so. We had fights over who gets to read it first, right? There was my brother, myself, and my dad, and whoever caught the male person first were like, ah, I got it. And you wouldn't, I would like go for 2 hours until I had read it front to back, right? So I was that kind of teenager. Now, I'm not that much into it anymore. But this was something that I could. I saw it was made by people I knew, and I saw how it was successful outside of our country. I'll never forget this. I may have shared this story before. When I was a foreign exchange student in Minnesota in the 1980s, the grandfather of my host family had fought. Well, I'm not sure if he fought in Europe in World War II, but he was in the U.S. military, and he was quite vocal about the United States kicking the Nazis out of Germany and out of the rest of Europe or wherever they were in the world. And he said things like, well, back then in the 40s, we, the Americans, we kicked your Germans' butts. And whoa. So he was quite vocal about this, to which I, as a 17-year-old, my only response that I could think of was, well, but you still like our cars today, don't you? And that kind of settled the dispute. So this became quite an extension of my nationality to a certain degree. And watching that show on Netflix, I think I can see why people would like to draw these conclusions, right? So now that we talked about the German car brand that you mentioned, so let's make sure that we don't forget any of those. So this is not a marketing effort. So you see BMW here, you see the 4 rings for Audi, you see Porsche, Volkswagen, Mercedes-Benz, and Opel, which outside of Germany is known as Vauxhall in the UK or as Holden in Australia. So so now we covered all the Germans, right? But what can we say about those other car brands, these other nationalities?
Well, I was interested in that series that we talked about. Was there was that the play between the French and the German, for example. This is one example. I mean, there were many different, but it was a great way of expressing this. Is that the French cars were always kind of a little out there, right? There was examples of many cars that were built, like Peugeot, who built these very unusual cars. We would call them concept cars, but people bought them. Not in the hundreds of thousands or millions of units, but they bought them, and the French were drawn towards this kind of sense of difference. But then again, when they were talking about the food, right? The food, I thought this was a great analogy. For Germans, the joy is in the ride to the food, in the wonderful car and the driving experience. For the French, it's the food that's important. So it doesn't matter how you get there. The car can look weird. It can run funny. It can have 3 wheels. But it's about getting there. About the food itself, which is part of that kind of Epicurean culture. Yeah.
Right. And there were 2 gentlemen in the French episode. One, a very wealthy entrepreneur who came to the meeting in his old, I think it was a Peugeot, or Renault, an older Renault. And it was a hand-me-down car from his mom.
From his mom.
who hadn't bought the car new either. So this is a millionaire who could afford multiple vehicles. He doesn't care. No. And so it's kind of a reflection of the French mentality of, hey, it's got 4 wheels. Maybe it's only got 3. Doesn't matter. It's going to get me to my destination. And the other gentleman on the show was a chef who really frowned upon the Englishmen eating baguette in the car while they were driving, because in France you don't eat in the car.
No,
you sit down to eat. Driving is one activity. Eating is another one. The 2 of them don't go together.
That's right.
And I will have to agree with the French. Because my dad, when he comes to visit me here in the U.S. in those big cars with the big cup holders, and I got my water or whatever, my coffee in there, my dad goes nuts.
Yeah.
What the hell are you doing? Why are you drinking behind the wheel? Why are you not alcohol, but why do you have to do that? Both hands on the steering wheel, right?
Yeah.
So an expression of how serious the activity of driving the car is, or in France, how serious eating and drinking is, that doesn't have anything to do with driving.
Right.
And I like how the French car design is usually non-mainstream. The most successful French cars, the Citroën DS, for example. So the Citroën, those 2 chevron type of symbols over the name Citroën. The DS, which was introduced in the late 60s, and DS with just the letters D and S and pronounced DS, which is French for goddess. It became a design goddess for years to come, even today. When I was in Paris, I saw an old original DS. The first reflex that I had was take a selfie with that car in the background because it's such a beauty, right? There's a few other brands here, Venturi, and the A, I think, is Alpine, which is a Renault spin-off. Some people would debate whether Bugatti is indeed French or not. I think Ettore Bugatti was himself from, I think, from the Piedmont, which is close to France. So he is Italian, but he built the plant or the manufacturing site in Monsheim, which was back then a German town. And after World War II, when the border was moved across Alsace-Lorraine, it is now a town located in the country of France. So that's what technically makes it a French company. But I think purists would argue that Bugatti isn't really French. But I'm digressing. Plus, they're really, really fancy and really, really expensive, which goes kind of counterintuitive to the French laissez-faire. I don't care what the car looks like, as long as it transports my baguette and gets me to a restaurant, then what else do I need, right? And you have the German car, perfectly engineered, tight fitting, hugging the corners, high speed on the Autobahn. What can we talk? What do we know about the Italian cars?
Well, see, and Tarun, this is great. Thank you very much for your input here. And the Italian cars, like bringing that sleekness, that style, the fashion, right? Think of Italian style and its impact on the world, and even in the fashion world, right? That translated into the cars, right?
Bella figura.
Absolutely, bella figura. Yeah, this is wonderful.
See, here we have some of those.
Absolutely.
I'm missing one brand here. I was looking for it earlier. Oh, here it is, Lancia. Here, Lancia may not be known here in the US. Lancia is part of the Fiat family. So Fiat being the big brand from Torino, the Agnelli family, right? So it's Fiat, it's Alfa Romeo, and Lancia. It used to also own parts of, I think they still own a minority interest in Ferrari. So that's the black horse on yellow background, SF Scuderia Ferrari. That's in Maranello. They are part of the Fiat empire, but they're a standalone, publicly listed company. But Lancia isn't very well known outside of Europe, and it's a struggling brand. But they've built very extravagant vehicles, similar to the design experiments that Citroën did in France. Lancia was known to be a little bit out there, like a Gucci Prada suit compared to your H&M Volvo.
Absolutely, yeah. The French car fitting in the small parking space. They actually did that in this show where they bumping. Actually, it's okay to kind of bump the cars in front and behind to get your car squeezed into these.
Yeah, they do that. They don't engage the handbrake in France, and sometimes even put it in neutral, so it moves easier if somebody else is using a parking spot. Obviously, only if it's a flat surface.
Absolutely. And a Land Rover, yes, the Land Rover. We're getting into, the British. You think of Land Rover. The Queen drives Land Rovers, of course, still does. Gets her corgis around.
Fun fact: now owned by the Indian company Tata.
Absolutely.
Not so much English any longer.
Not so much English any longer. And this is the point. I mean, the other reason we're talking about this is it's also the melding of car brands, the coexistence of car brands, and even the mergers and acquisitions that's going on in the world now is representative of the globalization that we're seeing here, and the importance of actually having cultural knowledge when you're putting some of these brands together. We can go back to Chrysler and Daimler with a situation where culturally, many people can talk to the failure of that through a cultural lens, because it was actually the different mindsets of the approach to engineering and the approach to the look of the car that really caused constant tension between the two sides of that equation. And in the end of the day, it was $30 billion of 10 years of wasted work. And now Chrysler has gone to Fiat with this joint venture. still some of the struggle, some of the same struggles, but I think Sergio Marchionne, you know, learnt from these. He was a wonderful leader, really a wonderful global leader, and
Yes.
recognised the culture was at the core of some of these tensions, and therefore they had to resolve some of these before they put the Italians, and also there was the Brazilians who had the great input into this as well.
And Sergio Marchionne was a visionary leader that was bemoaned when he passed unexpectedly. What was it, a year or two ago? He orchestrated this merger between Fiat and Chrysler, and I think what you see here in the U.S. is how they reconcile these two corporate and national identities in the Jeep brand. So they don't do a lot of badge engineering, meaning they don't take a car from one brand and put a different badge on the grille and sell it in a different market as that brand, which is General Motors is known for that. Also, other big conglomerates have been doing that, and Fiat Chrysler apparently isn't doing it that visibly. I'm sure there are synergies that they're using to make this work, but you see Fiat's and Alfa Romeo's reintroduced to the North American market. They had been gone for decades, and you see how I think the Jeep brand, which is a Chrysler brand, is adopting some Fiat genes from Europe, and some Jeep products are sold in Europe as Fiats, but I think that's how they were elegantly combining these two. But it's a constant struggle to not only make the people who build the cars work well together, but also create brand identities around the globe that work still despite those global, constructs of marrying these brands. I want to go back to what Torun said here earlier. When she was young, she drove a Lada. I commiserate with you and also sympathize with you, Torun. My family, we owned a Lada Nova, I believe, a Russian brand. One of the first vehicles in the 80s in Europe that were affordable with four-wheel drive. And my dad needed a reliable hauler in the winter months to get up and down the mountain and into town. So Lada was it for, I think we had it for 2 years. Very simple technology, worked for a long, long time.
Yeah. Well, if we just quickly jump back to the German, I mean, not all Germans are highly engineered, you know, because there was a touch on the cars that were produced in East Germany, and then made their way. And of course, you know, my Polish wife sat there and immediately recognized the Trumka, you know, that car that was ubiquitous in Poland as well, behind the Iron Curtain. So these things had an engine with 7 moving parts. I mean, you know, and apparently ordering it took 13 years. And the parts were all kind of sourced through the black market. That's the only way you could get them. It came with no guarantee, you know.
That was one of the motivators for the Berlin Wall to crumble, or the Iron Curtain to crumble, because East Germans were just fed up with the scarcity that they had experienced for 45 years. There were 2 car brands in East Germany, Trabant, which was more the everyman. Well, if there was such a thing as an everyman's car. Not everybody had a car in East Germany. But
it could be every woman's car too. Let's not forget this. There should be more responsibility.
Yes. Call me out on it.
But I have a question related to this. It's interesting. I think that most of, you know, people like to name their cars. And if when men think of cars, you know, I mean, maybe it's a bit sexist perhaps, you know, they look at this thing of beauty that they attach so much value to, and then they give it a female name. They say she's a great car. It's a you know, these kind of gender references to that people attach themselves to cars. But I think in terms of this is more, and correct me if I'm wrong, Torun, but thinking about more female sensibilities. I mean, I've just, as I said, as Christian said, we've just bought a new car for my wife. I think much of that, you know, her previous car was a V8, you know, Hemi V8 Grand Cherokee. essentially it was my it was the car I loved that she got, you know. And now we've gone to a very nice you know, again, you know, a Japanese car. We'll get into these in a minute. Lexus, which is, you know, as my daughter says, oh Daddy, the back feels like sitting on a pillow. You know, and I go, and that, well, of course, maybe I've scored a few points there, but it's a different experience, right? It's a different experience.
Well, I think Doran's got a point here. This is how I interpret that comment. I think a lot of vehicles nowadays are designed, I want to say, quite aggressively. So at least from if you look at the front of the vehicle or what you see in your rearview mirror, they are designed to express performance, to express agility, speed, and they have these slits for eyes. I mean, oftentimes the fascia, the grille of a car are equated to a human face. That's how we give cars meaning. We give inanimate objects some kind of human-like qualities. So the headlights are eyes and the grille or the mouth, whatever the analogy is, right? I mean, the BMW grille is called the kidneys because who comes up with this stuff? No. But I think it's interesting how the majority of cars on the market nowadays are quite masculine, aggressive looking, and you can only find a few manufacturers, a few brands I would say in France, in Japan, that design cars that are not that go against that trend. Yeah. So what does our friend Brent from Toronto say? Interesting research by Dr. 𝙏𝙬𝙤 𝘾𝙝𝙖 on how the Jeep brand was seen and marketed in the US, horse versus Germany, liberation markets. Yeah, there's a point to that, because in the US it's I guess a workhorse. And for Germans, well, I know for Germans it was seen as a liberation tool because American soldiers, GIs, rolled into German towns in their Wranglers. That was a military vehicle. The Jeep was a military vehicle, right? And for Germans, the Jeep is this is the car of the liberators. Yeah. True. Brent, you got a point there.
It was in Australia, I think, and when I think about car culture in Australia, it was always through the lens of the workhorse as well, because the country is and still is, you know, pretty much largely inhospitable. So the vehicles had to be tough. Therefore, and maybe we'll segue into the Japanese brands here, Toyota became really synonymous with longevity, the ability to take ruggedness into the countryside, and there's actually records of millions of kilometers being tried to put on one vehicle without engine rebuilds and all this kind of thing. It's a badge of that's a badge of honor, right, for people there. How long you can keep your cars, right? Now, obviously, we had many, but we had two, well, I would call Australian brands, which were Ford, the Ford version of the brand, and General Motors. But there was Ford and Holden, and it really came down to it was a binary choice between who you followed when it came to car racing for many years, until then, you know, the high performance Japanese cars and the German cars came into play. But up until then, it was kind of we can't really drive BMWs on the racetrack because that's, you know, they're not as good as our race cars, you know, and it was quite fun, you know. It really, no, to me, I followed that, not so much because I'm a car guy, but because I followed the competitiveness between the two, and it was a tribal thing, you know. It's a collectivist individualism that you could identify with that brand and follow it to the extent you could.
Fun fact on the Holden, you described it as a GM brand, which it was for a long time. However, the Holdens and Vauxhalls in the UK that were sold were actually rebadged Opel. Opel is a German brand. Which was bought up like 100 and some years ago by General Motors, right? So it's been a German brand under the General Motors umbrella, but they did their own engineering, own design, and the Vauxhalls, Holdens, and some of the GM models in the US were actually designed and developed in Germany. So it may have been a GM-owned Holden that you saw on Australian roads, but it was most likely designed and developed in the German the German lab.
Yeah, I owned a Holden Commodore. It had an Opel motor.
Opel Commodore. Yeah.
So yeah,
my family drove Opels that's how Opel is the brand that I learned how to drive on.
Yeah. Very cool. So let's switch over, and of course moving into the Asian, closer to Australia, of course.
Yes.
Asian car, Asian car manufacturers have been around for years. Toyota has been around for 80, 90 years. They were very early to the party. So, and again, these were iconic brands. Some of these are kind of together and higher end. You've got higher end Acura with an Infiniti, but Nissan. But these are, and I was talking to someone yesterday about the Mitsubishi. They drive a Mitsubishi, and I said, these are very popular cars in Australia. The brand Mitsubishi is very popular in Australia, seen as very reliable. I owned a Mitsubishi. I won't say the brand name because actually in Spanish it's not a nice word, but here it's called a Montero. And it was a great car, really great four-wheel drive car. So Japanese brands have had a strong influence now globally in many parts of the world. Japanese.
The one that's missing here is, I just see that, and that's my shortcoming. Subaru is not on there. So So a very popular Japanese brand here in the United States. You see obviously Lexus as the luxury spin-off of Toyota, Infiniti as the luxury spin-off of Nissan, and Acura, the luxury version of Honda. You can even see Honda and Acura logo design very close together. I think what unites the Japanese and the German car brands, or the identities associated with their cultures, is that of great craftsmanship and reliability, right? So I had a US mechanic once tell me that you want a German designed car built by Japanese, that would be the best car on the planet. That's what a US culture person said, right? A person that works with cars day in, day out. So I think both, if you think of Japanese steel, right? The knife culture in Japan. If you think of the warrior culture in Japan, if you think of tradition and longevity, all of these values represented in many of these cars that they build. And funny enough, in Germany, in the US, in other car building countries, the arrival of Japanese brands was initially frowned upon, like, oh, what are these? So there was a othering happening, right? So us versus them. Or as Toron commented earlier, Ford versus Ferrari, right? I still need to watch that movie. I think, Toron, you're the fifth person telling me this now. It's on my watch list, so I'll report back. So there was this. What was this?
Right? Isn't that an absolute monstrosity of a car? Every time I go past one, I say, who in their right mind buys a Hummer?
Well, but isn't that a reflection of U.S. culture in a way? I mean, I'm not going to judge Hummer, but just look at these U.S. brands. Hummer isn't even on there because Hummer is a GMC sub-brand, so to say, or a GM sub-brand. But Hummer is an expression of American ruggedness and individualism. It's the middle finger in your face. Why do we do it? Because we can.
Yeah,
we have the space, we have the resources, or so we think, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's one of the most U.S. brands you could think of. Similar with many of these ruggedness brands like Ram or a GMC or Jeep, those expressing conquering the West and conquering the land, and I think these are all automotive reflections of some American narratives.
Oh, they are. And, I do like the fact that the hybrid Lexus that we now own gets about 35 miles to the gallon. This Hemi Jeep, we can't push it past 15, so, there's a difference, right? And of course, it goes down to the cost of the fuel. The cost of the fuel has always been relatively cheaper in the US, the access to it, not always, but I mean, you've had over a long period of time. So it's a sticker shock every time people get out of their car to fill up their car in Europe or Australia or Asia, where the fuel prices are astronomical compared, sometimes double, sometimes double. So it's, so therefore it's a reflection of smaller cars in these, usually in these cultures, smaller, highly engineered, sporting type of cars, where they don't use as much fuel, perhaps. But then you go into here. It is a reflection of the culture. The largesse, the consumerism, is a reflection of the big truck culture and the SUV culture we see here. And yeah, I'm not afraid to say I kind of fallen into that. You do it because you can.
Right.
And that is what it is. And we can argue the pros and cons of that and the effect we obviously have on the planet. We're trying to be, and that's why we bought a hybrid. It's a great car. I think the engineering in these new now kind of, I'm not really sold on full electric yet. I mean, the engineering has to catch up, but I think it's a great melding, and it is an awareness around the world of what we're going through in terms of our use of natural resources.
So we talked about how some of these car brands may be reflective of the national identity of the countries that they're from. How do we tie the Koreans into this?
Yeah, interesting. Still, like really, when Kia and Hyundai came on the market in Australia, they were laughed at as kind of like the Tatars of the world, right? These were cars that were very unreliable, and they didn't really present much value in terms. They got you around, and that was about it. Now these, you sit in a Hyundai, and it's a nice car. These are highly engineered motor cars. So here's that example where a culture absorbs pretty much the best of all of they can from their local cultures, like the Japanese influence you mentioned, the German engineering and that kind of thing, right down to some of the more practicalities of making a car that suits many different markets, right? Yeah. Now they're obviously not making big pickup trucks and things like that, but this is it's essentially an everyman car. It reflects a culture like that.
Look at Kia and Hyundai that are built here in the US. They now make those big 7-seater SUVs that you won't be able to get around Seoul or any European city in, but they're made for the US market. Yeah. And I think what I identify with these Korean brands, and what I think is part of Korean nature, is this I'm not sure if that's the right word, utilitarianism. It's we capture the essence of what's good with many other car brands. So they took the Japanese precision engineering, and they took the affordability of German-made every people's car, and created a worldwide phenomenon. And I think if you follow car industry and car executives, you may remember that when Kia and Hyundai basically stepped out of that shadow of being this other Asian brand, or these other Asian cars that are not Japanese, and do we really like them? When they stepped out of that shadow, it coincided with Kia and Hyundai poaching senior executives from European and North American car manufacturers, namely their head designer. The head designer for Kia was a designer at Volkswagen before that. And a lot of the Kias now are built and designed in Europe for the European market. And the Koreans have fully understood, and they do the same here in the US. They do not invade another market with their home-produced products. We built it in Korea, hence it's best, and you buy it. No, they go and that's what the Japanese did before them. They go into these other markets, analyze the heck out of these markets, and build the cars designed for these markets. They don't come in with this arrogance of we have the best product. We build the product that you want. Here it is at affordable cost.
It's been commented when we work with clients and brought in local resource people from Korean people that comment on the slight nuances between cultures, like the Japanese culture, very highly aware of face, like Chinese cultures, and therefore to actually put a car out there in the market that was like I described in the early days of Hyundai in Australia, where they really were kind of almost laughed at, and but they took on that identity. There was less of that that sensibility where they have to really over-engineer something before they put it on the market. They were willing to put something out there that served the market to its very basic needs, and then kind of fix things along the way, which you would think of that's not something that a Japanese company would do, or a Chinese company, that really, really kind of want to put something nice out there, because it really is reflective of the face and how the company is seen. But we've seen it in other products, cell phones and things like this from Korea, where yes, there are mistakes that have made, huge mistakes that have caused big impacts on the market, and yet they've been able to survive because they're willing to be open and say, you know what, okay, we made the mistake, we're willing to accept the mistake, and we apologize for it, and we're going to change it, and we're going to improve it, and we're going to take the ideas and just what we've been doing all along. And that's why I think the Koreans have been very successful in creating a brand around their products that is now known as kind of reliable, highly engineered, and desirable in many cases.
Yep. Yeah. And I think finally, I want to touch upon something that you mentioned earlier when you talked about Sergio Marchionne, who was one of these visionary industry leaders who was able to bridge divides, cultural divides, and make mergers work to a certain degree. At least the Fiat-Chrysler merger seems to be much more functional than the Daimler-Chrysler ill-fated marriage was. Yeah. There's another international alliance of car manufacturers that has been out of the spotlight right now, but a year ago this was headline news in economic circles. The alliance between Renault, Nissan, and Mitsubishi, which was led back then by a gentleman by the name of Carlos Ghosn, who is a man with 3 passports, Brazilian, French, and Lebanese. Nice. And he was the poster child for a global leader for many, many years. Everybody was wondering, how do you make this work? The French and the Japanese, cross-minority ownership. I don't know what the corporate structure was. It was not a full-blown merger, but it was an alliance that is still in place to a certain degree. And he was the poster child for a global manager in adjusting himself and the leadership team around him to cultural differences and getting the best out of these different worlds until he fell from grace, right? We to this day, we don't know who's to blame. Mr. Ghosn is no longer in charge of that company. He was charged with tax evasion and fraud in Japan. He was incarcerated in Japan. He managed to get out on bail and illegitimately left Japan while out on bail, and fled to the only passport country that wouldn't extradite him. I think he's still in Beirut. I think he's still in Lebanon. We don't know what went down. We don't know why he wasn't all of a sudden the star manager any longer. That might be a cultural story to unpack if we ever get behind the truth. But not all of these international, intercultural industry marriages work out in the long term.
That's right. Well, it's been a great, and I just want to point this out. We had a purple Ford Escort in Australia, which I thought was a great car. It was purple. So I was telling our daughter the other day, the granddad had a purple Escort, and it was a great car. And then
it was called Escort in Australia as well.
They had an Escort in Australia. This was back in their 70s and 80s, and of course, ours was stolen, and Tharun says that hers was totaled by her husband. 400,000 miles. I mean, that's a car, right? That's a car. When you've really owned a car when you've got 400,000 miles out of it. That's great.
By the way, I think the Escort was developed in Europe by the European Ford division. I don't think they sold it in the US initially, and only after it was such a success in other markets, they decided to put an Escort model on US streets. There's, I think, I'm not sure how many Ford manufacturing plants there are in Europe. I know there's one in Portugal. There's one in Cologne, Germany. I guess there's one in England. I'm not quite sure where else. So the European Ford models don't always match up identical with the ones here in the US or in other markets.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's been fun. Long conversation, but fun. This is good. I could talk about this all day. This is
Two middle-aged white guys who proclaim not to be gearheads talking about cars.
I don't know. Tarun kept up pretty well here. You know, I mean, we got somebody who's really kind of, you know, looks like you've owned a lot of cars and had some fun with them, and that's important, right?
Did Torun tell us which one of all these cars was her favorite? Was that in one of the comments?
I don't know. Yeah, there seems to be a lot. There's Trump as well. Look at this. And Range Rovers and
Mazda. She owned a Mazda.
I hope that was a rotary. You know, that was the lovely rotary motor. You know, completely out.
Oh, the Wankel motor, which developed by a German engineer, obviously.
There it is, Mazda 6.
There we go. That was her favorite. There we go. By the way, I did an episode for my podcast, the Culture Guy podcast. Those of you who don't know it yet, check it out. I did an interview with a car manager, a former car manager. We should talk to him. Maybe we can get him on the program. He worked for many different car brands and worked in many different cultures. He would be an interesting candidate for this program. So if you haven't found it yet, check it out, the Culture Guy podcast, and it's with a guy about cars. You'll find it. Don't worry about it. We might even post a link in the comments. All right. Enough with cars for today.
Absolutely. All right, guys. Thank you very much. This has been Two Chaps, Many Cultures. Sensible. Well, there you go. Well, there's nothing wrong with being sensible in your car choices.
Exactly.
It's perfect. Of course, sensible is safe, and that's great. Yes, we'll pop the link up in the comments on the various channels. Thank you very much, everybody. It is time to go. It's time to drive out of here. I'm sorry, my car doesn't seem to start, so I don't have the sound for this one. But we will see you tomorrow for another show. I should have had that teed up, really. That would have just rounded things out, right? You know, yeah. That doesn't have the same effect. All right, guys.
We'll talk to you tomorrow.
Ciao for now.
Bye.